Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talk English to Me, the podcast where we explore everyday topics and help you improve your English along the way. I'm Gautier.
And I'm Santa. Thanks for tuning in to episode 4. Today we're diving into something we all think about: money. From how we manage it, to what it means in different cultures, and how we can talk about it in English. So, grab a coffee and let's get started.
Ever get the feeling that when you're reading the news about the economy, hearing all this talk about recession and debt, and it feels like kind of way out there. Like it doesn't really connect to everyday life.
I think a lot of people feel that way. It's easy for those big economic terms to sound abstract.
Yeah, exactly. And so today we're going to do a deep dive into some of those fundamentals and really try to ground them in something concrete. You actually sent us this really interesting piece of source material. It's a YouTube transcript from a channel called English Podcast Zone. It's episode 4, and it's titled Money English Learning Podcast Conversation.
And what's really fascinating about using a source like this one aimed at English language learners is that you often get these really clear explanations of complex ideas because they have to break it down for someone who might not be familiar with the terminology, right?
It's like going back to the building blocks.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's precisely what we're going to do today. We're going to use this conversation as a jumping off point to really understand the concepts of recession and debt and, how we even talk about these things in everyday language.
Right, because sometimes you need to step back and look at the basics to see how the whole system works. And this one was a dialogue, which is really cool because it shows these concepts in action.
Right.
So before we actually get into the story itself, I think it'd be helpful to just define a couple of key terms that they brought up right away.
Absolutely. And the first big one is recession.
Recession.
Now, the podcast defines it as a period of time when the economy of a country is doing badly, which basically means the country is making less money overall. And what's interesting about this very simple definition is that it really captures the essence of what a recession is. It's about economic contraction, things slowing down.
Okay, so that's the textbook definition. But in the real world, what does that actually look like? I know they mentioned some examples in the podcast. What are some of those things you start to see when a recession hits?
Yeah, they pointed out a few key indicators. So one of the most obvious and probably the one that hits people the hardest is job losses. When businesses struggle, they often have to let go of employees or sometimes even close down entirely. And then another sign is people start spending less money. Consumers become more cautious, more worried about the future. And then they also talked about the stock market, which they mentioned was going down at the time, especially in the U.S.
Yeah.
And that drop in stock prices is often a reflection of this broader lack of confidence in the economy.
Right. It's like this chain reaction. Less money being made leads to job losses, which then leads to less spending, and round and round it goes.
Yeah.
And then the other term they defined was broke. And that one I think is pretty self-explanatory.
It is. It's a very straightforward term. Broke simply means having no money. It's as simple as that. You're completely out of funds. And although the word itself is simple, the reality of being broke can be really tough for individuals.
Yeah.
Especially when it's tied to these larger economic forces.
Right. It's the personal impact of that economic downturn.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have recession, meaning the economy is shrinking. We have broke, meaning no money. So let's get into this dialogue they presented. It's this scenario where a character named Charlie goes to see a Mr. Corleone.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to say, the original podcast hosts had a little bit of a reaction to that name, Corleone.
They did.
And it does kind of paint a picture in your mind, right?
Oh, it definitely does. Corleone. I mean, it conjures up images of organized crime, which is not what you typically expect when you're talking about financial troubles.
Right. So Charlie's going to this Mr. Corleone because he's in a tough spot. He needs help. And it turns out that he has been pretty badly affected by this recession that we were just talking about. He's lost his job, which is obviously a huge blow.
Absolutely.
And because of that, he's racked up a lot of debt.
Yeah, and they go into some detail about the types of debt he's dealing with. I mean, we're talking he's got credit card bills,
Yeah.
which we all know those can be killer with the high interest rates and everything. He's got car payments, which is another common one, a mortgage. So, he owns a home, but there's that big loan attached to it. And then on top of all that, he's also paying for his son's college tuition.
Wow. Yeah, so he's got a lot of different financial pressures coming at him all at once. So he goes to Mr. Corleone and he asks for a loan. He's hoping that Mr. Corleone can bail him out. But this is where the story takes this really unexpected turn. It's not at all what you would think would happen given who Mr. Corleone is supposed to be.
It's a real surprise.
Yeah.
Because Mr. Corleone tells Charlie that he's actually broke, too.
Broke.
Broke.
Yeah.
He says he lost half his money in the stock market crash. So he can't give Charlie a loan, even though, you'd think someone with that kind of reputation would have endless resources.
And I thought it was really interesting how the original podcast hosts reacted to that. They were like, wow, if even a Corleone, this fictional character who's supposed to be connected and maybe even a little shady, if even he's broke because of the recession, it really shows how bad the economy must be.
Yeah, it's a powerful way to illustrate the severity of the situation. It's not just affecting individuals, it's hitting everybody.
Right.
Now, after the dialogue, the podcast switched gears a little bit, and they went into this language takeaway section. They wanted to highlight some of the key vocabulary used in the conversation. And the first word they focused on was loan.
Okay. Loan.
Yeah, and they gave a really clear definition. A loan is when you borrow money from somebody. And they specifically made a point of contrasting it with the word alone, which of course means being by yourself. And, those two words can be confusing, especially if you're still learning English.
Oh, yeah, they sound very similar.
They do. And then the next word they talked about was mortgage.
Mortgage.
And they explained that a mortgage is a particular type of loan that you use to buy a house or a property.
Right.
And what's interesting about a mortgage is that the property itself is used as collateral for the loan.
Oh, so if you don't pay back the loan, they can take your house.
Exactly.
Yikes.
Yeah. And they also had a helpful tip about the pronunciation of mortgage.
Oh, right, because it's one of those tricky English words.
It is. It's not pronounced mergage with a hard T.
Right.
It's mortgage without the T sound.
Mortgage. Got it.
Okay, good.
Right.
And then after that, they looked at this phrase, hit me pretty hard. Now, obviously, this isn't meant literally.
No, not like someone punched you.
Exactly. It's figurative. And they explained that it means something had a really strong negative effect on you. It really impacted you in a bad way. And they gave some very relatable examples.
Yeah, what were those?
Well, they talked about going through a difficult divorce.
Yeah.
Like if you're going through a divorce, that's a lot of emotional stress. It can really hit you hard. They talked about having a really bad cold, one of those colds that just knocks you off your feet. That can hit you hard. And then they even talked about the death of a pet, which is just, it's devastating.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And the last word in their language takeaway was tuition.
Tuition.
And this is a word that a lot of people are familiar with, especially if they've gone to college or university or if their kids have.
Yeah, I think most people know that one.
It basically refers to the money you pay to attend an educational institution.
Right, the fees.
The fees, exactly.
Yeah.
Most commonly, it's used in the context of higher education. But they did mention that in some countries, there might be tuition fees, even for public primary or secondary schools.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it varies around the world.
Okay, so that gives us a good handle on some of the vocabulary from the dialogue. And then the podcast moved on to this section they called Fluency Builder, where they focused on some common phrases that sound natural in everyday conversations. And the first one was, what can I do for you?
Ah, yes. This is a very polite, and it can even be a little bit more formal way of offering help to somebody, as opposed to just saying, can I help you? Or what do you need?
Yeah.
It suggests that you're really willing to go the extra mile.
Yeah, it's definitely a good phrase to know.
And then the next one was, I'm really sorry to trouble you. And this is a phrase you might use when you need to ask someone for a favor, or when you feel like you might be bothering them with something.
It's like a way of acknowledging that you're interrupting them or asking for their time.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
shows that you're being considerate. And they had some really practical examples, like needing someone to sign a form,
Oh, yeah.
or asking to leave work early, or even something as simple as needing to borrow a pen.
Right. It's those everyday situations where it's just a nice way to be polite.
Absolutely. And then the last fluency builder phrase was, on top of all that.
Oh, on top of all that.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this one is that you can use it to add to a list of things that are both good or bad. It's kind of versatile.
Oh, so it can be like a negative thing or a positive thing?
Yeah. So they had this rather dramatic negative example where someone lost their job and then their car got stolen and then they went through a breakup all on top of each other.
Oh, my goodness. That's rough.
I know, right? It's like a terrible streak of bad luck.
Yeah.
But then to balance it out, they also gave a positive example, Like, imagine having a wonderful birthday where all your friends come over and you get tons of presents, and then even more good things happen on top of that.
So it's just basically a way of saying and also, or in addition to.
Exactly. It signals that there's more to the story,
Right.
whether it's good or bad news.
Right.
Now, after exploring some of the language, the podcast moved into this really interesting discussion about cultural perspectives on debt. And I think this is where we can start to draw some deeper connections, especially to the economic concepts we've been talking about.
I agree, because they contrasted the way debt is viewed in North America and Canada with the way it's viewed in Europe, specifically in Switzerland. What were some of the key differences they pointed out?
Well, in North America and Canada, they said that using debt is really common, and it's actually even encouraged in some ways as a means of building your credit history. And then that credit history is what you need to be able to get bigger loans later on, like for a mortgage or a car loan.
Right. You almost feel like you have to have a credit card and use it regularly just to establish that good credit.
Exactly. And they even mentioned how, like, banks will actively market credit cards to students on university campuses.
Oh, yeah. They're always giving out free stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And that just goes to show how ingrained the concept of credit and debt is in the North American financial culture. But then when they talked about Europe, particularly Switzerland, they painted a very different picture.
How so?
Well, in Switzerland, they described a much more cautious approach to debt. Like, people are much more hesitant to take on debt. And they gave this example. If you want to get a credit card in Switzerland, even one with a relatively small spending limit, say 500 Swiss francs, they might require you to deposit even more money into your bank account as a sort of guarantee, like the 700 francs.
Wow. So you have to basically prove that you have the money before they'll give you a credit card.
Exactly. It's a much more risk-averse system compared to North America,
Right.
where they're much more willing to extend credit.
Yeah, that's a really interesting contrast. And the podcast host made a connection back to the recession, right? How did these different attitudes towards debt tie into that?
Well, they suggested that this more accepting attitude towards debt in North America might actually make people more vulnerable during a recession.
Mm-hmm.
Because if more people are carrying debt and then they suddenly lose their jobs or their income is reduced, they're going to have a much harder time paying back those loans. And that can create this sort of domino effect throughout the economy.
So it's like a double whammy. The recession hits, and then all that debt becomes this huge burden.
Exactly. And they ended that segment with a piece of advice that I think is pretty universal. They said, be careful with your money and avoid taking on debt that you don't absolutely need.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So to recap everything we've covered in this deep dive, we started by looking at the definition of a recession, that period of economic decline where a country is making less money overall. And we talked about how that decline can lead to job losses, reduced spending, and even a drop in the stock market.
Right. And then we clarified the meaning of broke, which is simply having no money. And that can be a very real and difficult consequence for individuals during a recession.
And then we looked at that dialogue they presented, with Charlie going to Mr. Corleone for help, and how even Mr. Corleone, this fictional character associated with organized crime, is struggling financially because of the recession. It was this really clever way to show just how widespread the effects of an economic downturn can be.
Exactly.
And then we went through some of the key vocabulary they highlighted, like the difference between alone and being alone, and what a mortgage is and how to pronounce it correctly. And then we talked about the phrase, hit me pretty hard, which doesn't mean someone literally hit you, but rather that something had a really strong negative impact on you.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we defined tuition as the money you pay to go to school or university.
Yep. And we also looked at those helpful conversational phrases like, what can I do for you? And I'm really sorry to trouble you. And on top of all that.
Right, those phrases that just make you sound more fluent and natural when you're speaking English.
Yeah.
And then finally, we had that really fascinating discussion about cultural perspectives on debt and how in North America, debt is much more common and even encouraged as a way to build credit. While in Europe, particularly in Switzerland, there's a much more cautious and debt-averse attitude.
And that contrast really makes you think about the different ways that societies deal with financial risk and responsibility.
It does.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it leads me to a final question I want to leave you with. Given these different cultural views on debt, with North America embracing it and Europe being more cautious, what might be some of the long-term consequences of those different approaches, both for society as a whole and for individuals? And how might understanding these different viewpoints help you make better financial decisions in your own life?
Wow. That's a really great question to ponder. And I think recognizing these basic concepts that we've talked about today, recession, debt, and how our cultures shape our views of them, it gives us a much better framework for understanding the more complex economic issues that we face in the world.
Absolutely. So we hope this deep dive has helped to clarify some of those fundamental ideas and maybe even giving you a few things to think about. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Talk English to Me. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion on money and that you've picked up some new vocabulary along the way.
Remember, money talks, but so does learning English. If you liked this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. See you next time.
Take care and keep talking English.